Welcome back to the Global Ledger. I'm Justin. In episode 31, we explored the anatomy of a liquidity crisis, what it is, how it starts, why it spreads, and why only a central bank can stop it. Today, we begin with the historical deep dives with the most important financial event of our lifetimes. That is the 2008 crisis. I'm going to break this down. I'm not going to give you the Hollywood version or the political version or anything like that. I'm going to give you the actual mechanics behind the collapse. This episode is high level. It's narrative. It's designed to make sense of the story. Later in the series, we'll do the full technical breakdown. But today, I want you to see the crisis clearly. Let's get into it. I want to start with what people think happened. When most people talk about 2008, they say things like, it was a housing crisis. People bought homes they couldn't afford. Lehman collapsed. The banks took too much risk. The Fed bailed everyone out. There's truth in all of that, but none of it explains the mechanics. Why the entire global financial system froze. Why perfectly normal markets shut down. Why the dollar spiked. Why credit just disappeared. And why the Fed had to create tools that had never existed before. To understand 2008, you have to leave the headlines and you have to go straight into the mechanics of this. And so because the housing bubble didn't cause the crises, it triggered the crises. The real problem was collateral. So before 2008, the financial world believed it had solved risk. Banks and broker-dealers didn't hold subprime loans directly. They held securities created from them. AAA-rated slices of mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations. So on paper, these were super safe, almost like treasuries. Shadow banks funded themselves using repo, borrowing cash overnight using these AAA securities as collateral. If you were a money market fund or a large institution, you were happy to lend against AAA mortgage collateral because it was supposedly stable. And for years, it was, until it wasn't. In 2007, something subtle began to happen. The lowest rated parts of mortgage securities started falling in value. Fast forward a few months, AAA tranches, which were supposed to be untouchable, also began to wobble. When a type of collateral loses credibility, funding markets react instantly. Lenders raise haircuts or demand more collateral, or shorten maturities, or refuse that collateral entirely. This wasn't about fear. This was totally risk management. And this shift, the loss of trust in mortgage collateral, is what tipped the first domino. So repo markets started to freeze. So as haircuts rose, borrowers, including big dealers, needed more collateral than they had. When they couldn't meet those demands, repo lenders pulled away. Funding costs spiked. Positions had to be unwound. Assets had to be sold. This is where the crisis jumped from subprime to systemic, because forced selling drove prices down, which made collateral look even worse, which forced more selling. This was a feedback loop, a spiral, a liquidity vacuum. And remember, dealers, not banks, were the center of this system. And this is where the dealer collapse begins. Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, Morgan Stanley. These were traditional banks. they weren't traditional banks. They were dealers, and meaning they survived by rolling huge amounts of short-term funding every single day. So when repo lenders backed away and haircuts started to explode, and collateral values fell, these firms could no longer fund themselves. It wasn't about solvency. It wasn't about, say, not having money, because that definitely wasn't the case. It was about not being able to roll funding overnight. That's the core of a liquidity crisis, like we've talked about before. Once forced selling begins, this downward spiral accelerates. So markets without liquidity don't decline slowly; they collapse literally. So as U.S. repo froze, that shockwave really transmitted into the entire world. Foreign banks, especially that relied on borrowing dollars through the FX swap market, suddenly couldn't get them. They needed dollars to fund dollar assets, but dollar funding had vanished, literally. So this is when the global dollar shortage began. Demand for dollars spiked. The dollar surged. Credit spreads worldwide blew out, and funding evaporated in Europe and Asia. Global trade finance seized. This crisis was now officially a global crisis. So when Lehman Brothers failed in September 2008, the system's deepest fear became a reality. A major dealer was gone, meaning its collateral, its repo trades, and its promises were suddenly frozen. If a dealer disappears, who returns the collateral? Who unwinds the trades? Who settles the positions? Who pays out the contracts, right? This uncertainty froze markets across the board. Repo, commercial paper, money markets, FX funding, interbank lending, credit markets. Markets weren't panicking. They were waiting for some kind of clarity, waiting for someone to take the other side. And no one could, because dealers were collapsing. The institutions whose balance sheets held the system together, these were the ones. So this is where the Fed starts to step in massively. So at this point, really the Fed had one job, and that was to stop this liquidity spiral. It did so by rolling out new tools, many of which appear in a document titled "The Fed Explained," and this is a great document when it comes to some of the Fed's responsibilities. And one of those tools that was created was the TAF. That stands for the Term Auction Facility. This gave banks liquidity without, any kind of stigma. Another one, and you'll find that one in the documentation as well when they're discussing discount window alternatives. If you happen to go check that out, you just go to Google, type in the Fed Explained, and the PDF document will come up for you guys. Another tool was the Term Securities Lending Facility. This is the TSLF for short. And this let dealers borrow treasuries in exchange for less trusted collateral. Really important. We've talked about collateral before. And if you haven't, go back a couple episodes and really pay attention to that one. And one of the other facilities was the Primary Dealer Credit Facility, PDCF. First ever discount window for dealers. In there, I quote this directly, actually, from the Fed Explained. Quote, primary dealers can borrow from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York on a secured basis. Unquote. So, extremely important. So swap lines to foreign central banks would be another one to talk about. This allowed the central banks, this allowed them to lend dollars to their own banks when offshore dollar funding really failed. And they also talk about this, and the Fed explained as well. And you had a couple more facilities in there. Support for commercial paper, money markets, and asset-backed markets. Also, massive repo operations. The Fed essentially became the dealer of last resort in these. And finally, large-scale asset purchases. What we later called QE. Though in 2008, it was really less about stimulus and more about repairing collateral markets. The point here wasn't to bail out banks. It was to stop the collapse of the hierarchy of money and prevent a complete breakdown of the global financial system. And it worked. Slowly, you could even say painfully, extremely painful, but it worked. What was 2008? And let's state it clearly. 2008 was a collateral crisis. That became a dealer crisis. That became a global dollar funding crisis. That became a liquidity crisis. And then became a full systemic collapse until the Fed restored everything. Housing was just the spark. Subprime, you could even say, was the match. So the real fire was in repo, collateral, leverage, funding, and dealer balance sheets. And that's the real story. The one almost nobody talks about. Thanks for listening to episode 32 of The Global Ledger. This was the kind of narrative overview. Later in the crisis arc, I will do a more deep technical dive with numbers, haircuts, collateral chains, funding flows, tying in credit default swaps, and all these things that were part of the picture, technical picture of the crisis. But now that you've seen kind of the big picture, episode 33, we're going to take you guys into the next major shock. And this shock is the 2019 repo crisis. And really a sudden spike that just foreshadowed everything to come. So once again, I'm Justin, and thanks for being here.